Who are we trying to solve a problem for? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? What's almost the kind of easiest way that we could do it that doesn't require lots of labor intensive stuff? And what's a series of assumptions that we have that we can either quickly validate or invalidate?
Today, I spoke with Dr. Satya Raghuvanshi, who is the VP of Clinical at the famous health tech company Accurx. So we talked all about clinical leadership and her journey from pediatrics to a hackathon to working as a clinical AI fellow at Babylon Health to her role now, where she is heading up a very large team of clinicians making a huge impact in health, in predominantly the primary care sector, but also secondary care. So we talked about product thinking, product development, the framework of how she's developed her own leadership mindset, and also what she looks for when she's hiring for her team. So this is something that if you are looking about developing yourself as a leader in healthcare, health tech, industry, you name it, this is something that you need to listen to, because she clearly has grown so much from her clinical role, but is totally still really grounded, and she's such a lovely person. Anyway, on to the episode.
So let's get real. Our value as doctors has significantly diminished over the last decade. So how can we turn that around by upskilling and creating rewarding and impactful careers on our own terms? Welcome to Disrupting Doctors' Careers. I'm your host, Dr. Abeyna Bubbers-Jones, and I'm on a mission to connect 1 million talented doctors with the best in diverse career opportunities.
Welcome to Disrupting Doctors' Careers. Today we're going to be talking about clinical leadership in health tech and other sectors. And to discuss this very topic, I am really proud to introduce to you Dr. Satya Raghuvanshi, who is the VP of Clinical at Accurx. So some of you may be familiar with Accurx, particularly if you work in the primary care sector. We're going to hear a little bit more about Accurx, but you may be aware it's a software company that is a communication platform for many NHS and integrated care systems. And it's been around for a few years and it's growing. Anyway, welcome, Satya.
Thanks, Abeyna. Yeah. And I've been a long time fan and follower, so really excited to be actually able to join the podcast and speak to you.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure, because we actually met in person in April for the first time at an exciting event at the Accurx headquarters in London. And at that point, you were talking about building teams. And I know, actually, let's talk about your journey. So from pediatrics, you're like literally the second pediatrician I've spoken to this week who is an amazing clinical leader. Previous one is Umang Patel at Microsoft. But tell me, how did you end up in a leadership position at a health tech company coming from a pediatric background? How did that happen?
I think I took a very non-traditional route, although I'm not sure there are many traditional routes, to be honest, getting into health tech.
No.
So had been doing pediatrics. I was only in my first specialty training year, and actually had the opportunity to go off and do a master's in public health. I had these, when I joined pediatrics, I had this very kind of grand ambition to go and be a humanitarian pediatrician, so working for, Medicine Sans Frontières and Doctors Without Borders, and probably a very romanticized view of what that would be like. And so I thought, the next step in the journey is really to understand health on a global scale. So I went off to the US to do a master's, and it was actually during that time that I started to develop an interest in health tech. So had the opportunity to go to hackathons. So at the university, they would run hackathons. They had a medical school attached. So they were, the first one I ever went to was a pediatric one, and I was appalling in it. We had a good idea. I think we were beaten out by other ideas, but I'd never been to hackathon before. And it was this idea of like working with engineers, working with data scientists and product managers to really develop an idea that could solve a bigger problem in the healthcare space. We talk a lot, I think, in healthcare about multidisciplinary teams and how that's really great to deliver care, but I've never worked in a multidisciplinary team with people outside of healthcare. And so as soon as I started to, this really kind of exciting ambition and feeling around there's so much we can do in the healthcare space that, you know, we just are underutilizing a lot of our existing technology or resources, which would make magnitudes of difference in healthcare. So started going to Hackathon, came back into pediatric training and had already got the bug by then and wanting to work in health tech and healthcare. And actually found the opportunity at Babylon Health. So that's where I started my career. Had lots of fellow colleagues as well who started there. And that was the first foray I got into working with a health tech space or in the health tech company. So I was working as a clinical AI fellow and still keeping up my clinical work on what was then their flagship product of a symptom checker. And that really started to kind of solidify that like this is something that I wanted to do longer term. And whilst I love pediatrics, love clinical medicine, definitely wanted to use my brain in a different way to solve very unbound and often complex challenges in healthcare, end to end using technology. Just haven't experienced anything like that before. So yeah, that's kind of how I started. You know, left Babylon, wanted to continue to maintain a career in that, and then saw the opportunity come up at Accurx, who at that time were looking for, I think, you know, one of their early clinical leads. Spoke to my sister, who's GP, and said, "Hey, do you know anything about Accurx?" Very early days of Accurx, but she was one of the few GPs in her practice who were using it, and she raved about it. And I thought, okay, there probably is something here. So that's kind of how I landed in the health tech space.
Brilliant. Just out of interest, is your sister, she's still GPing?
Do you know what? She is not. I think she's now followed in my footsteps. So she's now working as a health tech clinician in the VR space.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and they do really interesting stuff around basically building up clinical skills through the use of VR. So even things like communication skills, etc. And she builds some of those scenarios. So yeah, she's definitely I think now she's followed in my path, but we'll
wow, that's so interesting because yeah, I mean, I could say so much about that story, but yeah. I mean, it's really interesting how you essentially took a punt and just followed your passion. And then clearly it got you to a point where it's like, hey, I mean, actually a lot of people cut their teeth at Babylon, right? I know so many people who have worked at Babylon and have then developed careers outside of that in a leadership capacity. So what is it that you learned, particularly working as a clinical AI fellow, that Accurx really valued in you at that stage?
I think there were a few things. One was a really deep appreciation of product thinking and how you translate your clinical experience and your clinical background into product development. So I think at that point there were, you know, fewer clinicians who had that experience. So certainly coming into Accurx, and I remember that being quite a key focus of my first interview at Accurx, around how do you think about product? How do you take the skills that you've learned in your clinical experience, your clinical knowledge, and adapt it to a way that really helps to solve a user need that maybe one that you're not familiar with, but how can you have that adaptability of thinking to kind of surface that in product, and also can that thinking be pragmatic? Because I think there's often a lot of like blue sky things that we want to do, but can you take a pragmatic approach working backwards from kind of the end problem to say, here's how you would do this in a handful of scenarios or a handful of use cases. Here's how you might think about scaling that. So almost certainly, I think that was one of the key things that they were looking for. More broadly, I think it's also just the ability to collaborate. So coming into a team where you are a subject matter expert in a more niche space, actually, in a tech company, and can you work effectively with engineers? Can you work effectively with product managers to deliver an end-to-end solution? So what is your ability to collaborate and also feed that contextual awareness in a way that someone who's got no familiarity with the NHS can understand why they're building the thing they're building, and why it's important, and again, what problems it's trying to solve for. So I'd say those were probably the key things. I'm sure lots of other things, but I'd say those were the two standouts for me.
I mean, because obviously the experience that you gained at Babylon was fairly unique, and being able to develop that. Because how long were you there for in total?
I was only there for 10 months. So
oh wow,
yeah, it's a really
steep learning curve.
Short time, yeah. But the learning curve is just, yeah, like you said, it's so steep. You pick up so much in such a short amount of time. And I think once you've got the bug, it's very hard and not to let it go, basically, and not continue to pursue a career. Because if I think about the Babylon Fellows that I'm still in touch with, you know, lots of them, for us, it was very much a stepping stone to a further career in health tech. So it gave us a lot of independent skills and attributes, I think, that we could take on, even if we were going back to clinical practice. Certainly, lots of them have continued on to build like very successful careers.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. I can think of so many people. But going back to today's episode question, which is, what does clinical leadership in health tech in particular look like? I mean, you've been at Accurx for like 3-4 years now.
Yeah, just shy of 4 years.
Yeah, and obviously at the time there were about 16 people in your team, and then now there's over 250.
Yeah,
is that great?
Yeah, that's right. I think I joined as like employee number 20 or something. And now
so how has your I'm trying to ask the question, when it comes to clinical leadership, how has that changed or morphed from the early stage to what it is now, which really isn't a long period of time in the grand scheme of things? But what have you noticed?
I think certainly there's probably a few things for me. So when I first joined Accurx, it was very much, you're the clinical lead in one product team. So you've got a, you know, fairly undefined scope of what you're trying to achieve. We've got an idea around, we want to build kind of a communication record that follows a patient. Your job is to work with the team to execute that and to come to a product where, you know, it's intuitive, it's intuitive to use, it's user friendly, it solves a need for both the healthcare professional and the patient. So it's very heavily a product focused role, and that makes sense because Accurx is a product focused company. We're led by product development, and we invest heavily into that. I think over time the leadership role on the clinical side has really changed. So part of it is we've grown an in-house clinical team, so we've hired lots of clinicians, and they're doing a number of key skills. So they're still doing the product development piece. There's a huge piece around what we call kind of contextual healthcare awareness as a company. So one of the beliefs that I have is, you know, you really have to care about what you're doing to do it day in, day out. And so when you are doing that, you need to have real empathy for people in the system, people who are healthcare professionals who are working in these very often, you know, limited resourced institutions and trying to deliver the best quality of patient care. So something that's really important to me, and I think more broadly to us, is that, do people who work here have empathy for healthcare professionals and patients? Are you kind of focused around the mission and why we care about it? And do you understand that? Because working in the NHS is so different to working in any other industry. And so how do we build that contextual awareness and almost kind of empathy internally about why this is such an important mission, why it's such an important problem to solve for? So that's been quite a key focus of the role, kind of within Accurx. I think how the leadership structure has evolved is definitely building a really high performing like clinical function at Accurx that's really clear on why you have clinical leads in a company. So they're not just there to be subject matter experts. They're not just there to, you know, manage the clinical safety and the regulatory pieces. And they're not just there to be the default, you know, would a patient do X thing. So it's been trying to take a lot of the activity that we do as clinical leads, which is very broad, everything from relationship management to contextual awareness, and really make it very clear what the role of clinical is within that. And I'd say that's probably more my role now, is trying to take the broad kind of overview of clinical is to be the translation between the user need and the product. That's kind of, you know, broadly what we do as clinical leads in a health tech space. But my role is to say, okay, but what does that actually look like? You know, how do we equip people with those skills? How do we measure progress against that? How do we say that this is what we expect of the development of the clinical leads? It's been building out that function.
I mean, I think that's really interesting because you're asking quite key questions which are bigger thinking, really, as you talked about product thinking, you talked about product development. And when we think about doctors to try and get themselves into that mindset, I mean, for you, what was that journey like?
Yeah,
Because it is a jump for a lot of people to start thinking in that capacity. And we know, we've had a conversation about this, how some doctors, quite a lot of doctors, especially if all the totality of their experience is clinical, they struggle to see the bigger picture beyond that clinical. So it's like, how have you developed that change in mindset? What has that taken you?
I think personally for me, it's honestly just doing it on the ground. So we're trying to get back to asking myself a series of questions of when we're trying to do something. So again, who are we trying to solve a problem for? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? What's almost the kind of easiest way that we could do it that doesn't require lots of labor intensive stuff? And what's a series of assumptions that we have that we can either quickly validate or invalidate about the thing that we're doing? And so that kind of framing has helped me develop kind of from a product perspective. I've also been incredibly privileged, to be honest, to work with very good product thinkers and product leaders who I've learned a lot from, either through, informal conversations or lean coffees, or just by direct observation of the way that they operate in meetings and conversations, and working more closely with our product managers to understand what the things that motivate them. How do they think about bringing teams together and product thinking? So I'd say there isn't kind of one universal way of developing that, but I think a lot of it is speak to people, speak to people who are doing it, understand how they think about it. There's so much resource, in terms of like written resource, etc., to really understand what does product development in healthcare look like. And then there's no kind of replacement for just doing it and starting to think about that. And you can take that approach that I've outlined very briefly on kind of how you think about product development to any problem in healthcare space, right? So if you're a clinician working in hospital, you probably don't have that much capacity, but you can probably identify a bunch of issues that you're like, gosh, it would be so good if somebody fixed this, or wouldn't it be better if this happened instead of this? And so if you start to lean into that mindset of trying to make those changes quickly, and things that you can influence, some of those things will be bigger than you. But take that same approach, actually you'll start getting into that kind of mindset of let's solve a problem. And that's the way that I think about product. Good product should solve a problem. And so it's the same way that you could approach anything that you're trying to do, from a quality improvement project in a hospital to to product development.
Yeah, I mean, talking about leadership in hospitals compared to leadership in health tech, what do you think have been the main differences? Like, at what point did you leave pediatrics?
So I left after SC3, so I completed my SC3 year. So I left quite I'd say into pediatric training, just very long by its nature. But I felt I'd got a good breadth of experience where I could use that clinical knowledge experience. And to be honest, I left with quite a lot of uncertainty about whether or not I would have any sort of future in health tech. It was a real kind of, I'd say it was a big decision in the moment. It certainly felt very big, maybe doesn't feel as big now, but you came to this precipice of like, do I continue in training but have almost very little to no time to try and do this healthcare thing that I really want to do in the health tech space, or do I take the gamble and say, let me do it and let's try? So I set myself this like, the equivalent that it will take me to do a PhD for 3 years, and I'll see what I can achieve in 3 years. And with the understanding that I may not be able to go back to pediatric training because I have to give up my national training number, but I would always be able to go back to some sort of clinical full-time work if I wanted to. And that's also the beauty of medicine, is that you can do that. But that's a personal limit that I set for myself.
But how do you think the leadership skills that you require in, say, a clinical role, an actual healthcare clinical role, compares to what you require in, say, a health tech or industry role? What are the main differences? I
think actually there's just lots of similarities. I don't think there are distinct differences, if I'm honest. So I think within a healthcare setting, you have to be an excellent collaborator. So if you're trying to drive and work in a leadership structure in a hospital, it's very similar to trying to do that in a health tech space. It's just a different organization with its own nuances. So I think for me, one of the main things is you've got to be a really strong collaborator. you have to be able to communicate well, and be able to, prioritize and be very clear and concise on what the ask is and what you're expecting of people. The expecting of people, I think, is really important as well. So I think for a good leader, you have to set clear expectations and identify how do you support someone to progress, how do you support your team to develop. Those skills are true of being a leader in a hospital as they are of, being a leader in any other industry, but especially in a health tech space. And I think you also have to be a little bit fearless in that sense. I think you've got to be able to take the gamble. I still remember when I was thinking about leading pediatrics, every other clinician I spoke to at that time was saying, don't do it, or that I wouldn't have a career. I'd come back to pediatrics in less than 6 months. And I think if I hadn't had probably, the support systems that I had, I wouldn't have necessarily taken the gamble, because you work so hard to get your medical degree. You work so hard for that national training number. It almost, feels like gold dust at that point. And so to have those conversations saying like, this is a huge risk. I might not be able to achieve much here. I don't know. It's a big deal. So I think there's an element of like, don't be afraid to walk the untrodden path, because the beauty of medicine is your skills are so adaptable and universal for other healthcare settings. So I think there's probably little. I think the other thing that I think is probably quite similar both across health tech spaces and working within a healthcare sector is you've got to also understand the culture under which it operates. And so you've got to be able to understand and kind of work within those cultural barriers. So you might have fear of change, you might have really poor change management process implementation. And you've got to understand those in order to be able to drive meaningful change. And again, that's true whether you're trying to do it in the NHS or whether you're trying to do it in the health tech space.
I think that's really, really great advice. And I mean, for doctors, I mean, going back to the question where we talked about what can doctors do to develop their leadership skills proactively, to position themselves for leadership roles in health tech or beyond. Beyond talking to people and being curious, because actually one of the things that came out of our MedTech roundtable a few weeks ago was that some of the doctors who are founders or leaders in their respective companies say they don't necessarily hire for skills anymore, and that's the buzzword that's going around now. It's all about skills first hiring. Now they're saying they focus on hiring for curiosity, right, which is quite interesting. So what does that mean? Hiring for people who are generally really buy into the companies, who just are really motivated to find out more, will be asking those questions similar to the questions that you were asking earlier on. But then, the challenge that a lot of doctors face is, how do I get into companies? How do I get that experience? How do I talk to people? Because everyone's doing it now. And, not every doctor or product person has time for 100 one-to-ones and coffees. So is there anything else that they can do that you can think to help actually kind of prime themselves for like the chief medical officer roles, the leadership roles, beyond obviously our program that we run for doctors in industry, but kind of any practical advice? Like, for example, you've talked about going to hackathons in your journey and things like that. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's quite a lot of like activity-based things, so hackathons, fellowships, courses that you can do that help to upskill you, and lots of those are subsidized or accessible on online forums, etc. So you'll get lots of different opportunities there to be able to generally upskill. I think there's something to be said for that kind of almost entrepreneurial spirit, in the sense of solving a problem within your existing care setting. So wherever you're working, taking that initiative to say, let me try and fix something, because that experience speaks real volumes when you then come to like an interview. So part of the challenge that we have is we have lots of people who are interested in roles. It's very hard to differentiate between people who may just be looking to dip their toe in versus people who are incredibly passionate, because you don't always have the same exposure to those opportunities depending on your role and your work life, all the other things that are on your plate at any one moment. So I think the kind of definitely see what kind of how you can upskill more generally through accessing some of these programs. There's something to be said about just building a bit of a network of people that you can talk to. So appreciate your comment, and not having time for coffees, etc. But reaching out, I get lots of people reaching out on LinkedIn, and they'll say, here's some general advice about things that you can do. And actually speaking to people about different roles and like what their role is like. So what do they actually do in a company? So that gives you a really good sense. Also really empowers you when you get to an interview, or like, I've spoken to, I'm really interested in doing this role, and actually I've spoken to people at your company who maybe don't do the role, they've told me a little bit about the company, or I've spoken to other people who've done this role in other companies, and you're then better informed when you get to that stage. And just, I think you're right in the sense of curiosity is so important. So we also don't hire for skills. We hire things like, we're not expecting anyone to have done product development, to have, come from a health tech company. We're looking for people who show potential. And by potential, I mean, can you think flexibly around a problem? So don't have, can you have fixed ideas, but actually are you open to those fixed ideas being challenged when you're given more contextual information or something that maybe doesn't quite fit with the answer that you've given? So really that flexibility of thinking, and we always obviously centre it around a not unfamiliar healthcare problem, so it should feel quite reachable for most people. We also look for, just general skills of, do you demonstrate kind of responsible ownership? So when we ask you about things like, can you just think through what are some of the clinical safety elements? How would you kind of work with the product team to share that understanding? None of these are difficult questions. We're just expecting you to be able to collaborate and, find a way that engages the team around this issue. And so I think it's really that kind of potential, which is really hard to capture, but it is curiosity, it is flexibility of thinking, it is just being a nice person. Honestly, that will take you further than you will ever imagine. So like, be nice, be lovely. You're going to meet members of the team, they will give feedback. So engage in that process. I think it's interesting. I was speaking to somebody who started their own company, and they said they have an anti-jerk interview.
What does that involve? An anti-jerk interview? I love that.
I think it's just a bunch of questions basically about, what do you care about? How do you work with people that you kind of disagree with? Etc., which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But for us, the other thing is, are you a cultural fit in the organisation? So, I've met with doctors who generally, when we talk about the mission, that's a thing that personally brought me here, but I don't expect everyone to be, care about the mission as much, but it's so important. So if you are, one of the things that we're trying to do, for example, Accurx, is join up communication across the NHS. Yeah. So one of the big red flags for me is when somebody's really derogatory, if they work in primary care, they're derogatory about their secondary care colleagues, or that's actually antithesis to the mission, what we're trying to achieve. And if you come in with that opinion, but you're also not willing to say, hey, there's a problem and this is something I want to solve or make better, that will be a bit of a red flag to me. So are you mission aligned? Are you kind of going to fit well in the culture and ethos that we have as companies? So, will you be transparent about your mistakes? Because we all make mistakes, and that's human nature. Will you show responsible ownership if you're given a task? Will you work collaboratively to deliver it? Will you own it kind of end to end? Lots of these things, it's not easy to assess for an interview, but it certainly gives you a taste of what someone's going to be like when they land in the organisation. And I say some of the clinicians that struggle more with it are the ones who are maybe a bit more fixed in what they know, and so or the cultural ways of working that they've worked with in whatever health setting they've previously worked in. I'd say they probably struggle the most in some ways.
I think that's interesting because, again, like we speak to a lot of companies, and I see companies are increasing the number of touch points in their recruitment process so they get to know more about the candidates or the doctors that are coming through. Do you think that's necessary, especially for leadership roles, or is it like what you get people to do? Because at the end of the day, we know that you can professionalize getting into a job, right? It's in many ways it is a skill, but you also do want to pick out those people that are going to be right, as you said, like right for your team, right for the company. So, but does that translate to making sure that you get more of a 360-degree view of who they are for as long as possible? Because time is another factor. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll be honest, I think dragging out the interview process is a little bit unfair to everyone involved. And the reality is some people will be fantastic or professional interviewers and, will get through the door very easily. Other people will take a little bit more time. So we have a very standardized kind of interview process where we try and make it incredibly fair for every candidate. I think for me personally, whilst I really want to know the candidate, I don't need to know everything about you. And what I want to know about is, why do you want to work here? Why do you care about working here? What's the thing that you personally want to be driven by? What's like driving you in this process, and why you're engaging with this interview, or why you thought, hey, this is a role that I want. The most important thing for me though is getting a feel for this person outside of just me. So getting to meet the team. So we always invite people to come and have lunch with the team, because they have an equal vote in whether or not that person joins. And so that I think is quite important, because something that I found is where you have that imbalance actually ends up causing so much disruption down the line. And we've got to a place now where like our clinical leads will feel very comfortable saying, yeah, this person's great. Or actually, I'd just love to know a little bit more about how they might support someone who's more junior than them. And so that will allow us, one, to give us a little bit more to dig into if we want to have another interview. But often we just try and standardize the interview process with a kind of meet the team session. And actually, you are still being assessed in that meet the team session, because that's where you're going to land. And I think for the clinical leads specifically, it is also really like, actually, could you be a good leader, in the sense of, would people follow you because they enjoy working with you? They understand, that your role and you've communicated that well to them, and how have you set that team ways of working really? It's not something we assess for interview, it's something we assess throughout the kind of probation period. But that's really important as well once you actually join. So I say for me, it's really important to know what drives you both personally and professionally. I don't think it's important, and maybe this is, I don't know, maybe people will disagree, to have a full 360 view of a person. I'd love to say we do that, but I think it's really hard to do that. And I think sometimes you only get that sense once somebody's joined, because there's kind of like we all do, there's the persona we have at interview, and hopefully you can bring your authentic self to that. But actually sometimes that authentic self is just seen after you've been here a while. And there's some of the like barriers that come down, you start to feel comfortable in the setting. So that's I'd say where we get more of the 360 view of someone.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, I've really appreciated all of your amazing insights into your own journey, but also what clinical leadership looks like or can look like, particularly in a health and a tech scenario. And also, I want to emphasize there aren't that many women in leadership in health tech that I know that are really doing remarkably well. And I always get excited speaking to people like you, because it's not easy. It isn't easy. And I can only imagine how much you've grown in this process and how much of an impact you're making to our country and our society through what you're doing at Accurx. So thank you. I want to say thank you.
I want to say thank you to you, because honestly, when I was first looking at moving roles from pediatrics, it was actually a Facebook post that you put up on the Medic Footprints group.
Oh wow!
That gave me the confidence, and I read through like every post on there, awesome. And that was the thing. So yeah, thank you so much as well, because I don't think I'd be here without certainly without my Facebook engagement. So
great,
yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's always a win. And we don't always hear all the stories. So I'm really glad that we got to connect so I could hear about your journey. So thank you so much, Satya. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way of doing that?
They can either add me on LinkedIn, or they can drop me an email at satya@accurx.com. So very happy to be contacted.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Satya.
Thank you. Take care.